I want you to picture the scene, if you will. If you could put the next one up for us, Kirsty, thank you. I want you to picture the scene, if you will. Where were those words spoken? John records Jesus as sharing those words on his heart, which are very complicated, because it can sound as though he's constantly repeating about oneness, and he's constantly repeating about the Father being in him and he in the Father, and the people joining in as if they were in the same relationship as he and the Father have, etc. But it can all sound very dense and very complicated. And strangely, John records this prayer as taking place at the Last Supper, the night before Jesus died. And therefore it makes it sound almost like an even more strange conversation. Is this the sort of prayer life that Jesus actually has with God? And here he is on the night before he's going to die. I'd like us, though, to try and walk through this passage very gently, because I do believe it reveals to us something quite wonderful. Quite wonderful. And so it's worth giving a bit of time to it. I know it can seem difficult to read John chapter 17, but actually it is truly beautiful when you spend time with it. Strangely, as a small aside, it's the longest prayer and words of Jesus as a single speech anywhere in the Bible. Interesting that, isn't it? So there's something about this that John wrote down word for word, remembering it because he thought it was important. So try and go with it if you possibly can. I want to introduce you to two words. The first comes from the Hebrew language, ahava. Should we try and say it in church? Ahava, behind your face masks, bless you. And that comes from the Hebrew language, and the second word comes from the Greek language, agape. Agape? Yeah, you've heard probably of the second one quite often, but maybe not quite the first. If you see Jesus as simply being in a vacuum, all on his own, you won't really understand the depth of who he is. It makes much more sense to see Jesus as part of, and indeed a fulfillment of, a much bigger story, which is the story of God's relationship with humanity, and particularly with God's people Israel. If you put Jesus into that story, a lot of other things then start to add up and make much more sense as Jesus reveals who he is and his life. That's why I'm quite a fan of encouraging people to read the Old Testament, even though it can be very hard going sometimes, because then you see the background and context into which Jesus came. And if you want an abbreviated version of that, I can only recommend you to various little videos by the Bible Project, because like these two videos, they're incredibly useful in a world which has only a short amount of time to do anything, to be able to pick up the key points. Let's go to ahava for a moment. Ahava really comes out of one of the great prayers that most Jewish people would say every day. You know, like we say the Lord's Prayer? Some people in church are nodding. I'm sure you all do, don't you? Hopefully most of you do. But also, it is part of our Christian tradition that we not only realize that we're praying to God, we recognize we're praying also with many brothers and sisters throughout the world as we share in this beautiful prayer in the words that Jesus himself gave us. So, as we think about that, the Jewish people have a similar prayer. It's called the Shema. I'm looking at Marion, who remembers being on a coach with me once in Israel, and virtually the very first thing that we were told, wasn't it? Get out your books, and we're going to say the Shema together. And we all looked at each other and went, what? The Shema is like the equivalent for the Jewish faith of the Lord's Prayer. And they would say it at least once, sometimes depending on how sort of devout you were, you would say it once or even up to 3 or 5 times a day. It comes from 2 passages of Scripture. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5, and Leviticus 19, verse 18. Words that you probably know quite well, especially if you are a seasoned Anglican and you know your Book of Common Prayer, or you happen to know these words because they're the 2 commandments that Jesus taught us. Can you put the next one up for us, please, Kirsty? Is that all right? Is it stuck? It's all right. Thank you, love. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And from Leviticus 19, love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. Words that sound familiar? Now here's the key. It's so easy to think, well, about loving God is about therefore coming to church. And loving your neighbour is what we do out in the community. And they can almost seem 2 separate things. What you do in church on a Sunday, well, is that replicated by what you do down Tesco's on a Monday? And can you see that what you do down Tesco's on a Monday actually reflects on what you do on a Sunday? Can you see that? So to love your neighbour is to love God, and to love God is to love your neighbour. Now, of course, the wider world tends to do the second if it can do anything good at all, and forget the first. And the downside of that, as we will come on to see, is that we are a bit like a plant that's been cut off. You know, like this time of year, you often cut ivy off a tree. You know, you cut that base of the tree, the base of the ivy, so that you leave a gap so that the ivy will die. Yes? Someone please nod at me, because otherwise I'm not good at gardening, and this is about the limit of my gardening skills, all right? But you cut it, don't you? So that it will die. And it's a bit like that with what goes on when we only think of the 2nd commandment. We're cutting ourselves off from the very source that feeds us. And we'll only then have a certain shelf life, because guess what? We run out of energy. As I've said to you many times before, I'll say again though, I can be in church on a Sunday and I've then got to come over to Banwell or whatever for another service or something like that, and I drive down that church drive in Kongsbury, and by the time I get to the end, I can be in a totally different frame of mind. I may have been praising God and saying how wonderful he is and everything else, and I get to the bottom and I can't turn out onto the A370 in Kongsbury, and I'm there going, well, come on, get into the traffic lights in the roadworks this morning, Dave and Mai. I was going, oh, you're having a giraffe. Come on. Yes? Have you been there? People in church are shaking their heads because they're wonderfully beautiful people. I'm sure many of you at home might be able to nod your heads a little bit more. And it can get worse, can't it? It can be that somebody has annoyed us, somebody has let us down, somebody has done something to us, and of course it gets us wound up or hurt or both. And suddenly there's a whole disconnect between this idea of loving everybody and loving God and our reality. Following the way of Ahava was never meant to be simply easygoing. It was a command. In other words, it's not about feelings or just a nice fluffy sense of warmness inside. It's work, and it's hard work. but it is something worth doing, as we'll come on to see. But the key to this slide is the word "and." I know you've heard me talk a lot about the word "and," but actually it is a beautiful word because it's the language of love. Have you ever thought that? You know, when actually you're in a situation where, if I take my daughter when she was growing up, I would say, you need to be in by 10. And she would come home at midnight. And do you lock the doors? Do you go to bed and switch all the lights out? One or two people here are nodding. I'm sure you wouldn't really. You stay up and you wait. Because although you've made the rules, you actually also realise that you love that person far more than the rules. And indeed, you'll always go that extra mile. That's the language of love. That's the language of "and." I won't embarrass my daughter live by telling you that one night the phone went about 4 a.m. "Dad, we're stuck in Bristol. We've run out of money. Can you come and pick us up?" Well, I know they've been to a nightclub, and the sort of attire that you wear to a nightclub may not be sort of about keeping warm, or perhaps best stood on a corner in Bristol. So I've never driven so fast in all my days to go and pick them up. Would you just leave them there? I hope not. And of course you would go. One or two people here are still nodding. I'm going to move on. I think they got the point. The language of "and" the language of love. Next one, please. Oh, can you go back one, please, love? That's it. Beg your pardon. So, sorry, you need to go back one more, if that's all right. Oh, hold on. Hold on, we're having a few problems. One, I don't know where you've gone to? Okay. Bless you. Is it not working? Next one. Brilliant. Okay. So that's the language of ahava, the language of love, the language of seeing love as not just feeling, but the language of intent, the language of will, the language of purpose. What about the word agape? Well, the word agape is from the Greek language. So when the life of Jesus was being written down by the New Testament writers, it was written in Greek. And they took the word ahava and they looked at how they were going to translate it into Greek. But what's a wonderful thing, and I didn't know this until doing the research for this particular sermon, they didn't base it on a simple translation. They didn't just try and translate ahava into a Greek word. Instead, they came at it from a totally different point of view. And that was to look at the life of Jesus, what he said and what he did. And the closest word they could relate to that was the word agape. Isn't that lovely? All right then. I thought it was lovely, because it would have been so much easier to go to a dictionary or whatever and just go dum-de-dum, but they stood back and they reflected and they thought. And it's based upon the life and the work of Jesus. And again, what we find, of course, is that all these sayings of Jesus, all these words that he speaks in all his talks, would really be nice, but they wouldn't be life-changing if it wasn't for what he did. If you think about all the marginalised people that he went to see and to be with, that really only makes sense of the Good Samaritan story in Luke 10, doesn't it? In other words, he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. And because he walked the walk, the talk makes sense, and indeed inspires and encourages us. And so agape, again, is not just about feeling, and often it can be a very feeling word. I think there's actually a perfume or a sort of a beauty product that's now called agape. And that can make you feel nice and warm and cozy or whatever, but the reality is agape is hard work, because it's about caring for the marginalised and seeing that there are no them, there is only us. And Jesus goes further than that. When you look at Matthew 5 verse 43, he says, "You have heard it said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy." That's from the Old Testament. "But I tell you this, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Just have a thought for a moment. You can hear those words and you probably may have well heard them before. But just think about somebody who's upset you, somebody who's angered you, somebody who may have hurt you. What do you do with those people? Do you just tend to avoid them? You know, they don't get a Christmas card this year. You take them off your social media list. You just sort of blank them. Maybe you hold them at arm's length because you're worried that they may hurt you again. It's really hard to follow this commandment of Jesus, really. But what he knows is, of course, that this is what changes the world. Not that you just love those you love or who love you, but you love those who you find hard to love. Now we're starting to understand how God sees relationships. It's not just about it's all nice. It's hard work. Next one, please, Kirsty. Thank you. So you've heard me say that the idea of relationships is not easy. We all know they're important. We all know that it's something that without our relationships, not just of our nearest and dearest, but the idea that somehow we are a community, a society, it would all work. But how do we do it then? If it's just hard work, is it all about effort? Is it all about just striving ever harder? And what happens when we run out of energy? What happens when we fall short? Well, of course, the reality is it really helps from our Christian background to look and discover that we need to hear the words of 1 John chapter 4. There's John's Gospel, which was what we're looking at this time, but he also wrote 3 letters. And the first of those letters is called 1 John, and in chapter 4 of that, in verse 10, he says this: "This is love, not that we love God, but that he has loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sin." We haven't got time this morning to get into the whole idea of sin, but in this context, particularly in this context, don't see it as just moral stuff, what you may have done wrong. See it much more as just that stuff that keeps you from those who no longer you phone, that keeps you from those who you have tried to somehow keep at arm's length because they've hurt you. See it as that stuff where you maybe long in your heart that things could be different in your relationship with that person, but you don't know how to do that. Those feelings even within yourself that you feel as though it's so not what I want. This is what Jesus came for and what he died for. And strangely, and I think, we've lost this a little bit. We tend to think of prayer as something where we've got to talk to God and speak to him and tell him what he needs to do, please, by tomorrow or even today. But there's another aspect of prayer which is simply gazing in awe and wonder. Awe and wonder. I can remember when I was doing a particular retreat with a group of Franciscans, and we were asked to go into the chapel at any point over 24 hours and spend at least an hour looking at the cross. Just you and the cross. Nobody else, nothing else. Just look at it and see what it says to you. I've never done that before in all my years. 5 minutes and I was done. What am I going to do now for 55 minutes? Looking at a watch, how long have we got left? But bit by bit, slowly, I came to realize and think about my life. And slowly I came to realize what Jesus has truly done for me and continues to do for me. Not just the wrong bits, the morally wrong bits, but all the other stuff. How much he truly loves me and loves you and loves this world. And sometimes you just got to sit there, and I can promise you, it felt as though somebody was sucking the breath out of my lungs. It was almost to the point where I couldn't breathe anymore because it was so amazing. We don't tend to do that much these days. But strangely, that is what 1 John 4 verse 10 is trying to help us to see. Just how much you are loved. You can either try and do all this stuff, loving people in your own strength, or you can do it because you first recognize God loved you. And through loving you, he calls you to try and be witnesses to that love in the world. Next slide, please, Kirsty. We're going to wind up now. What I find then so interesting, and I love the Bible for this, and I love God for this. Wasn't it all there in the beginning? Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. What does it begin with? Hear. Now, I'm someone who tends to talk a lot. Partly it's my job, but it's also my nature. I often describe myself as simply a mouth. But the real point is, isn't it beautiful that right back when Moses was given these commands by God and he shared them with the people, the first word which so often we forget is hear. In other words, pray. Listen. Listen to my heart. Listen to the silence. Quoted you before that wonderful phrase from that film, Mary Magdalene. Whether you particularly like that film or not, there's a beautiful phrase that Jesus says, can you listen to the silence? As he's listening to the waves lapping on the Sea of Galilee. Can you listen to the silence and can you trust what you hear? I think that is just, it could almost be a sort of a slogan for our time. In a world that's normally so busy, a world that's struggling with the idea of lockdown, can we take it and make a problem into an opportunity to listen to the silence? And in the silence, can you trust what you hear? This is to go to the heartbeat of God's understanding of relationships. Because there is something beautiful, isn't there, when you walk into a room and the person doesn't just tell you everything that they think is important and how marvellous they are. You ever been to a dinner party like that? I'm often sat next to people at a wedding. I love weddings, and occasionally I get invited to the reception afterwards. But do you know what often happens? The bride and the groom, they go, oh crikey, we've invited Matt. Who can we put him next to? Oh, Great Aunt Maud, she goes to church. So I'm sat next to Great Aunt Maud, and it's very nice, but usually Great Aunt Maud decides this is her moment to tell me all that's wrong with the church and how the clergy are the problem and really what I should be doing about it. And I'm going, yes, thank you very much, yes, yeah. I would rather be sat next to anybody else. Have you not had that? And actually, there's something beautiful when somebody says, how are you? How are you? Who are you? Tell me a little bit about you, rather than, I'm going to tell you all about me. Interesting, isn't it? Listen is an actual word of love, I think. And it's something I'm working at. And maybe we could all work at during this time of lockdown. By listening, I think we build community. And we can build a community into being one. And going right the way back to that John 17 passage, if you can remember where we started, one of the ways it ends up is, can they be one as we are one? Not just can we be nice to each other at ecumenical gatherings between Anglicans, Methodists and anybody else. In more case, can we be one and see the world as one? Can we actually see the other person and try to give them value and worth as a child of God? Whatever their background, whatever their faith, whatever their sexual disposition, whatever their situation, can we see them as a child of God? And we start there. Can we see that actually this can make a big difference into how we shape our society? In a world where wages and salaries are just totally disproportionate, aren't they? You know, I met a carer this week, and she's on £7 an hour, risking her health by going into somebody's home and actually getting them up in the morning, going back again at 8 o'clock at night to put them to bed, and not getting paid for the travel time. I cannot believe that is right. Because I know to the person I was visiting at the time, that carer is their lifeline and does so much for them, way beyond simply what they're supposed to do on their job sheet. So this stuff isn't just about being nice, it's about changing our society. I think Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, uses the word levelling up, and he's talking about north and south, but I would also say levelling up needs to take place between those who currently get much wealth and those who get little. And of course that costs. And it may cost us, both at home and here. So this way of love and relationships comes with a price tag. Not just in pounds, shillings and pence, but as a way of living. And we'll talk more about that next week. Interesting stuff? I'm getting a few nods here. Ahava and agape. Beautiful words. If you'd like to look at them a bit more, I can only really recommend the Bible Project videos. These two particularly are absolutely super. I've put the links in the hymns and songs sheet, but there's loads of other stuff they've done. It's an amazing project, really, of two young people plus a load of helpers now. And it goes literally around the world, all supported by people who choose to do so out of their generosity. And it's free to everyone, and it's free on the internet and on YouTube, etc. I think we'll wind it up there. But when you look at a passage like John 17, and it's hard to read, and you sort of wonder, how can that possibly be relevant to me? Just spending a little bit of time, working through it, thinking about the words, thinking how they can actually relate, looking at the background of where they come from, seeing Jesus in his context, well, actually great things can come. Just like when we looked at justice, we found that justice wasn't just about equality or retribution or fairness. It was much more than that. So God's understanding of relationships is far more than just a nice, cuddly feeling. Should we close with a prayer? Lord Jesus, as we share this understanding that you have of the relationship you have with the world and with us, we are in awe that you should love the world so much, that you should love each of us so much, that we can scarce take it in. Inspire us in these days. Even when we fall short and we fail, help us, though, not to take our minds and our hearts off of who you are and of what you would like us to do. Thank you that you pick us up, you dust us off, and you encourage us to try all over again, for such is your good pleasure. For you did not come to condemn the world, but actually to save the world through your Son. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. We're going to have